This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we journey into the deep past to answer a provocative question. Were hunter-gatherer societies truly egalitarian? We often mistake their equality for a passive state of nature, but the reality is far more dynamic. We'll explore the fierce egalitarianism used to humble the proud, challenge the man-the-hunter myth, and uncover the forager kings of the Ice Age. Join us as we examine how our ancestors engineered social harmony and why the rise of permanent settlement eventually shattered the ancient heart of the forager. Chapter 1. The Active Maintenance of Fierce Egalitarianism. When we imagine the lives of our ancestors, we often fall into the trap of the noble savage myth, picturing small bands of people living in effortless, instinctive harmony. We imagine a world where equality was the default setting, a natural byproduct of having no money and few possessions. However, the reality revealed by those who have lived among the world's last remaining foraging societies is far more dynamic and, in many ways, more impressive. Egalitarianism in these groups is not a passive state of being. It is a hard-won social achievement. It is what anthropologists call fierce egalitarianism, a system that must be actively and sometimes ruthlessly maintained through a suite of social tools designed to deflate the ego and prevent the rise of any individual who might seek to lord it over others. To understand how this works, we have to look at the psychological landscape of groups like the Juhansi of the Kalahari Desert, a people also known in anthropological literature as the Kung. For a Juhansi hunter, bringing home a large kill like a giraffe or an eland is a moment of immense pride and skill. In a different type of society, this would be the moment the hunter ascends to a position of power, using the meat to create deaths and build a following. But among the Juhansi, the community has a very different reaction. Instead of cheers and praise, the successful hunter is met with a wall of cold indifference, or more often, sharp-tongued mockery. This practice is known as insulting the meat. When a young man kills much meat, he might start to think of himself as a big man and see others as his inferiors. To prevent this pride from turning into a desire to dominate, the elders and other members of the camp will speak of the kill as scrawny, worthless, or barely worth the effort of carrying home. They do this to cool his heart and make him gentle. The hunter himself is expected to participate in this ritual of humility, downplaying his own achievement to show he still respects the autonomy of his peers. This de-emphasis of the individual is further reinforced by a unique social tool known as the arrow trade. Among the Juhansi, the person who kills the animal is not necessarily the person who owns the meat. Instead, the owner of the arrow is the owner of the kill. Because arrows are frequently traded as gifts and tokens of friendship, the person who technically owns the meat might be a woman who stayed in camp, or an elderly man who hasn't hunted in years. This system ensures that the credit for a successful hunt is distributed across the social network, preventing any single hunter from accumulating the social capital that comes with being a primary provider. This is a classic example of reverse dominance. In the animal kingdom, and in many human societies, dominance works from the top down, where a few individuals use their strength or wealth to control the many. Hunter-gatherers have effectively turned this pyramid upside down. In a reverse dominance hierarchy, the many act in unison to dominate the one. They are continuously vigilant against any sign of arrogance, boasting, or stinginess. If a person tries to act better than others, the group's first line of defense is ridicule. If teasing and gossip don't work, they move to shunning, treating the offender as if they don't exist. In a small band where survival depends entirely on the cooperation of your neighbors, being ignored is a terrifying and effective punishment. No human being can live for long alone in the bush, and this social pressure usually forces the individual to align back with the group's egalitarian ethos. The Hadza of Tanzania provide another window into how equality is negotiated rather than simply felt. For a long time, the Hadza were seen as the ultimate altruists, sharing everything they had with a generosity that seemed almost superhuman. But recent behavioral research has challenged this romanticized portrait. In studies of the Hadza, researchers found that only 40.9% of participants shared surplus voluntarily. Meanwhile, 30% of participants actively took resources from others, sometimes taking more than was strictly necessary to reach parity. These numbers suggest that the Hadza are not necessarily motivated by a pure, innate desire for fairness. Instead, they are averse to inequality primarily when it is personally unfavorable to them. Equality emerges not because everyone wants to give their surplus away, but because those with less are willing to assertively take what they need. This reveals a mechanism known as demand sharing. In our own culture, we tend to view sharing as a donor-centered act, where the person who has the resource decides who gets it and expects a thank you in return. Among the Hadza and many other foraging groups, sharing is recipient-centered. If you have something, others have a right to demand a portion of it, and it is considered the height of rudeness to refuse. This isn't charity, it's a social obligation that prevents any one person from accumulating a cache of food or tools that could be used as political leverage. In fact, studies of the Juhansi found that nearly 34% of daytime conversation was devoted to complaining about the perceived stinginess of others. This constant social badgering ensures that resources keep moving through the group, functioning as an informal but powerful equalizer. The political structure of these bands is equally unique because it is built on the total respect for individual autonomy. There is no chief, no king, and no boss who can issue a command and expect it to be obeyed. While most bands acknowledge a headman, the title is often misleading to outsiders. A headman has authority but no power. He leads through persuasion, example, and his ability to build consensus. If he suggests the group move to a new watering hole, he does so knowing that he cannot force anyone to follow him. As one member of the Dobe Juhansi famously put it, each person is a headman over himself. Decisions that affect the whole group, such as moving camp or resolving a major dispute, are made through long, exhaustive discussions that can last for days until everyone is satisfied with the outcome. This consensus-based model is slow, but it ensures that everyone's voice is heard and that the group remains cohesive. This emphasis on individual choice is what allows for the extreme fluidity of these societies. If a person finds a particular leader too pushy or a neighbor too difficult to get along with, they have a very simple political tool at their disposal. They can leave. Band membership is not a fixed, rigid thing. Families move between different camps frequently, following seasonal resources or visiting relatives. This ability to vote with one's feet acts as a natural pressure valve for conflict. It also means that anyone who wants to lead must be exceptionally well-liked and cooperative, because if they become too bossy, their followers will simply disappear into the landscape to join a different band. This mobility is perhaps the most fundamental safeguard against the emergence of permanent hierarchy. We also see these leveling mechanisms in the way hunter-gatherers handle their most basic interactions. Among the Benjele of the Republic of the Congo, there is a formal grievance process called Mosambo. If someone feels their rights have been impinged or that someone is being a bully, they don't go to a judge. Instead, they call for the attention of the entire camp and loudly articulate their grievance for everyone to hear. This public airing of laundry forces the community to engage with the problem and prevents resentment from simmering in the shadows. It is an improvisational theater of justice, where the ultimate goal is to restore harmony and ensure no one is being coerced. Even the way these societies perceive skill and status is designed to promote cooperation over competition. Among the Chimane people of Bolivia, anthropologists observe a distinction between antagonistic status and synergistic status. Antagonistic status is based on dominance, intimidation, and the desire to be above others. Synergistic status, by contrast, is awarded for merit, humility, and community-mindedness. In Shimane culture, status is not awarded to the strongest or the most aggressive, but to those who bring the most good to the team. Cooperation is seen as a sign of a worthwhile individual. This creates a kind of competition to be the most even-handed person in the group. Rather than a race to the top, it is a race to the center, where the most respected individuals are those who work hardest to ensure everyone else is taken care of. The role of play in maintaining this equality cannot be overstated. This use of play to suppress aggression has deep evolutionary roots. Primates use a relaxed, open-mouth display, the precursor to the human smile and laugh, to signal that their rough-and-tumble interactions are not genuine attacks. Similarly, canids use the play bow to communicate non-hostile intent. Human foragers have weaponized this biological signal into a social tool. The insulting the meat ritual is essentially a form of adult play, using humor and mockery to diffuse the very real threat of individual dominance. From a young age, children in foraging societies are raised with non-directive parenting styles. They are rarely told what to do and are encouraged to learn through exploration and imitation. Their games are almost entirely non-competitive. Because there are often few children of the exact same age in a small band, they play in mixed age groups where comparing skills makes little sense. There is a strong social opposition to drawing distinctions between people, and children are taught early on that it is bad manners to brag or point out that they are better at something than a playmate. This culture of play extends into adulthood, where rituals and dances often involve a suspension of normal social roles and a focus on shared joy rather than individual performance. But why did humans develop such a complex and effort-intensive system to stay equal? Some believe it was a purely practical adaptation to a high-risk environment. Hunting is an unpredictable business. A skilled hunter can go days or weeks without a kill. In such a world, sharing isn't just a moral choice, it's a survival strategy. By sharing your meat today, you are essentially storing it in the bellies of your neighbors, creating a social safety net for the day when your own hunt fails. This reciprocal altruism reduces the risk for everyone. Another compelling theory for the maintenance of this fierce egalitarianism is the presence of lethal weaponry. Unlike our primate cousins, who must rely on physical size and strength to dominate, humans have long possessed tools like bows, poisoned arrows, and spears. These weapons are the great equalizers because they allow any individual to kill any other with relative ease and little risk to themselves. In a band where everyone is armed, trying to boss people around is a dangerous game. It creates a kind of social Cold War, a state of mutually assured destruction where it is in everyone's best interest to remain humble and avoid making enemies. If you push someone too far, they don't have to be stronger than you to end your life. They just have to be patient. This reveals that the social structure of hunter-gatherers is not a sign of simplicity, but a sign of sophisticated social engineering. They have recognized that the human urge to seek status and dominance is a constant threat to the stability of the group, and they have built an entire culture designed to keep that urge in check. From the way they talk about their food to the way they raise their children, every aspect of their lives is a deliberate choice to prioritize the autonomy of the individual and the harmony of the collective. While these mechanisms are incredibly effective in small-scale, mobile bands, they are also fragile. They depend on high levels of face-to-face interaction, deep kinship ties, and a lack of accumulated wealth. In these settings, the social cost of breaking a norm is high because everyone depends on everyone else. But as we look closer at the relationships within these groups, we begin to see that even in the most egalitarian settings, there are subtle differences in influence and voice. If these tools of leveling are so dependent on the specific conditions of the mobile band, what happens to the human social soul when those conditions begin to shift? Chapter 2. The Marathoners of Prehistory, Dismantling the Myth of Male Dominance. For nearly half a century, our understanding of human origins was cast in the shadow of a single powerful image, the lone male hunter. This narrative, famously codified during a 1966 symposium titled Man the Hunter, proposed that hunting was the primary engine of human evolution. It suggested that the need to track and kill large game drove the development of our big brains, our stone tools, and our complex social lives. In this story, men were the providers, the innovators, and the protectors, while women were relegated to the domestic sphere, passively gathering plants and tending to children. This division of labor was presented not just as a cultural choice, but as a biological destiny, rooted in the idea that pregnancy and child-rearing made hunting impossible for women. It was a vision of the past that conveniently mirrored the gender stereotypes of the mid-20th century, providing a natural justification for the patriarchy of the modern world. But as we look closer at both the archaeological record and the lives of contemporary foragers, this myth is beginning to disintegrate, revealing a history that is far more fluid, cooperative, and egalitarian. The cracks in the Man the Hunter narrative appeared almost as soon as it was written, though they were often ignored or explained away. At that same 1966 conference, the researcher Hitoshi Watanabe documented Ainu women in Japan hunting with the help of dogs. Despite his own observations of women's skill and participation, Watanabe superimposed a lens of male superiority onto his final interpretation, dismissing these women as peripheral to the real work of men. It has taken decades of systematic reevaluation to realize that these exceptions were actually the rule. A recent groundbreaking study that combed through ethnographic reports from the last 100 years found that in 79% of the foraging societies for which there is data, women were active hunters. This wasn't just opportunistic killing, it was purposeful, skilled, and deeply integrated into their identity. In South America, Awa women in Brazil are frequently observed returning from the forest with bows and arrows, having successfully tracked and killed game. These women have their own toolkits and favorite weapons, passing their tracking knowledge down through generations. In many of these cultures, the grandmothers are actually considered the best hunters in the village, possessing the acquired wisdom and extreme patience that younger members lack. This ethnographic reality is backed up by a silent witness, the bones of our ancestors. For a long time, archaeologists suffered from a profound bias. If a skeleton was found with hunting tools, it was assumed to be male. If it was found with ornaments, it was assumed to be female. But modern genomics and bioarchaeology are rewriting these stories. In the Andean highlands of Peru, at a site called Willamaya Potjaxa, researchers discovered a 9,000-year-old burial of an individual surrounded by a hunting toolkit of stone projectiles and animal processing equipment. For years, the assumption would have been that this was a great male hunter. DNA analysis proved otherwise. The individual was an adult female. This wasn't an isolated case. A probability analysis of big game hunting burials across the Americas from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene suggests that between 30 and 50% of these prehistoric hunters may have been female. We see similar patterns in other cultures, such as the high-ranking Viking warrior in Sweden, long assumed to be male until genomics confirmed her sex, or the ancient Scythian nomadic groups, where 1/3 of the women were buried with weapons, having lived and died as warriors. This flexibility is supported by an often overlooked biological reality. While the popular narrative paints women as the weaker sex, exercise science tells a different story. In terms of pure, explosive power, men generally have an advantage. They are the power lifters of the species. But hunting, especially the kind of persistence hunting practiced by early humans, is not a sprint. It is a marathon. It involves tracking an animal for hours or even days until it collapses from heat exhaustion. In this arena of endurance, women are physiologically superior. The hormone estrogen, which is more prevalent in females, encourages the body to burn stored fat for energy before using up carbohydrates. Fat is a slow-burning, high-calorie fuel that allows for incredible stamina. Furthermore, estrogen receptors are twice as old as testosterone receptors in our evolutionary history, suggesting that the female body was the primary template for the endurance-based survival of our species. From an evolutionary perspective, women were perfectly designed for the long-haul tracking required to bring down large game. The assumed burden of pregnancy and lactation also turns out to be less of a barrier than once thought. In many foraging societies, women continue to hunt and gather well into their pregnancies and resume shortly after birth, often with the support of a complex network of childcare providers. This brings us to the concept of alloparenting, or cooperative childcare, which is a hallmark of egalitarian foraging societies. Unlike the nuclear family model, where a mother is solely responsible for her infant, hunter-gatherer groups operate on the principle that it takes a village to raise a child. Fathers, grandparents, and even unrelated adolescents all participate in the care and feeding of the young. Among the Mbengela Bayaka of the Congo, men are incredibly active in childcare, spending a significant portion of their day holding and playing with their infants. This shared responsibility frees up women to participate in high-stakes economic activities like hunting or trading. It also creates a social environment where children grow up trusting a wide range of adults, fostering the deep cooperation that defines the group. The Mbengele and the Agta of the Philippines also provide a fascinating perspective on how gender equality is maintained through the division of leisure. In most modern agricultural and industrial societies, women perform the vast majority of housework and emotional labor, even when they are also working outside the home. But a recent study of these two groups found a remarkable 50-50 split in work and leisure time between men and women. Researchers looked at social capital, essentially how many friends and influential relatives a person has, to see if it gave one spouse more leverage to avoid work. In our society, a husband with more status might use that power to get out of doing the dishes. But among these foragers, social capital had almost no effect on the household budget of time. The cultural norms of equality were so strong that they overrode any individual's attempt to use their reputation to gain an advantage. Both partners contributed significantly, and both enjoyed an equal amount of rest. This balance is tied to a unique feature of hunter-gatherer social organization, multi-level sociality. In many later agricultural societies, the social structure is built around brother hubs, where men stay in their natal villages and women move to live with their husband's family. This practice, known as patrilocality, creates dense networks of related men who can easily form alliances to control resources and dominate women. But hunter-gatherers live very differently. Because they are mobile and follow seasonal resources, couples are free to move between the camps of the husband's family or the wife's family as they please. Computer simulations of this movement show that when both sexes have an equal say in where they live, the result is a camp where most people are not closely related to each other. This lack of deep male-dominated kin networks prevents the formation of rigid hierarchies. Instead of being trapped in a patriarchal clan, individuals are part of a fluid, expansive social network where cooperation is extended to unrelated neighbors. This gender fluidity is not just economic or social, it is often ritualized. Among the Khoisan of southern Africa and the Hadza of Tanzania, initiation rituals involve a deliberate blurring of the lines between male and female. During these ceremonies, girls may mock male genitalia and carry weaponry, assuming the persona of hunters, while boys assume feminine personas and roles. These rituals serve as a powerful psychological tool, teaching the youth that gender is not a rigid, inescapable cage, but a fluid set of behaviors that can be assumed or discarded as the needs of the community change. It reinforces the idea that the survival of the group depends on the ability of every individual to step into any role. The political dimension of this equality is perhaps best exemplified by the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois model. While often associated with later sedentary complexity, the Haudenosaunee maintained a social structure that reflected deep foraging roots of gender parity. In their society, women, specifically the clan mothers, held the ultimate political power. They were responsible for nominating the male chiefs, and, crucially, they held the power to remove them if the chiefs failed to serve the interests of the community. This provided a specific political check on male dominance that ensured leadership remained a service rather than a form of control. It demonstrates that gender equality in the ancient world went far beyond the hunt. It was woven into the very fabric of governance. The spiritual life of these groups also reflects this lack of archy. While we often think of religion as a source of patriarchal control, Forager spirituality is frequently ungendered. We see the twilight of this era at Catalhoyuk, a 9,500-year-old proto-city in modern-day Turkey. Though it was a sedentary site, it represented the final flourishing of the foraging spirit. Isotope analysis of the bones at Catalhoyuk shows that men and women had identical diets and spent their time in the same spaces. They were buried under the floors of their homes with similar grave goods, suggesting that even as humans began to settle, the ancient commitment to equality remained. The famous female figurines found at the site, once interpreted as mother goddesses, are now seen by many as symbols of the high status of elderly women, reflecting age and wisdom rather than a gendered hierarchy. In these societies, rituals were practiced privately in the home, and symbolic elements were accessible to everyone. There was no specialized priesthood to gatekeep the divine, and both sexes participated equally in the spiritual life of the community. This vision of a gender-equal past challenges the sexual contract theory proposed by early Darwinists, which argued that the human family was based on a man providing protection and meat in exchange for a woman's sexual loyalty and labor. Instead, we see a world where women were important producers, skilled hunters, and autonomous decision-makers. The relationship between men and women was characterized by harmony and cooperation rather than command and exploitation. Men did not make a fetish of virginity or chastity, and they made no demands for sexual exclusivity that weren't reciprocated. Relationships were entered into and exited freely, and the social glue was not coercion, but the mutual need for survival in a high-risk environment. As we dismantle the man-the-hunter myth, we are left with a much more complex and hopeful picture of human nature. We see that humans are not hardwired for patriarchy or male dominance. Instead, our history is one of extreme adaptability, where gender roles were shaped by the needs of the environment and the practical necessity of cooperation. This equality was not an accident. It was a deliberate cultural achievement, maintained through fluid movement, shared childcare, and a fierce resistance to any form of big man politics. But if this egalitarianism was so successful for hundreds of thousands of years, what happened to change it? How did we move from the shared leisure of the Mengele to the rigid hierarchies and deep inequalities of the modern world? To find the answer, we have to look at the shadow of complexity that begins to emerge when resources are no longer scarce but abundant. Chapter 3: The Shadow of Complexity: Forager Kings and the Caging of Freedom. The story of humanity as a collection of small egalitarian bands is a powerful one, but it is only half of the truth. If we look only at the mobile groups of the Kalahari or the Congo, we might conclude that hierarchy was a late invention of the farming era. We might believe that until the first seeds were planted, no human ever truly stood above another. But there is a shadow that falls across this sunny picture of our prehistoric past. In certain corners of the world, where nature was not a harsh taskmaster but a generous provider, hunter-gatherers built societies that were as rigid, as stratified, and as unequal as any medieval kingdom. These were the complex hunter-gatherers, and they prove that you do not need a plow or a field of wheat to create a king. To find the most striking example of this, we have to travel to the sun-drenched coast of southwest Florida. Long before the first Europeans arrived, this land was ruled by the Calusa. They were a people of the water, and their empire was built not on corn or beans, but on the staggering abundance of the sea. While most of the world's hunter-gatherers were following seasonal game in small, flexible bands, the Calusa were building a state. At the height of their power, they controlled a territory twice the size of modern-day Belgium, governing an estimated 50 to 60 politically united villages. We know about the Calusa through a remarkable historical accident. In 1549, a Spanish ship was wrecked on the Florida coast. Among the survivors was a 13-year-old boy named Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda. He was taken captive and lived among the Calusa for 17 years, eventually becoming a translator and a witness to a world that defies every stereotype of foraging life. Fontaneda described a society led by a hereditary sovereign, a king who held the power of life and death over his subjects. This was not the persuasive, informal leadership of a Hadza headman. This was absolute, institutionalized power. The Calusa king was a sacred figure, often seen as a semi-divine mediator with the spirit world, and he demonstrated his authority through the ultimate display of dominance, human sacrifice. The capital of this maritime empire was Mound Key, a massive man-made island built from millions of shells and bones. At its center stood the king's house, a structure so vast it could hold 2,000 people. From this elevated seat, the sovereign oversaw a specialized society that included a permanent military class and a powerful priesthood. The Calusa did not live hand-to-mouth. They operated a sophisticated tribute system. Subordinate villages were required to pay the center in mats, hides, feathers, and captive people. This was a society of classes, a ruling nobility, a class of commoners, and a bottom rung of slaves. What allowed the Calusa to abandon egalitarianism was their mastery of their environment. They were master engineers. On Pine Island, they dug a canal 4 kilometers long, a project that required moving 30,000 cubic meters of earth. This wasn't just a path for canoes, it was a piece of industrial-scale infrastructure for fishing and transportation. Even more impressive were their water courts, enormous, inundated rectangular structures, some covering thousands of square meters, that functioned as living refrigerators. By trapping fish in these enclosures, the Calusa could maintain a reliable, year-round food surplus. In the language of anthropology, they had moved from an immediate return economy to a delayed return economy. In an immediate return system, like that of the Juhansi, food is consumed shortly after it is acquired, leaving no room for accumulation. But in a delayed return system, people invest labor in assets like water courts or fishing weirs that yield food over time. When you can store food, you can store power. The individuals who controlled these water courts and canals controlled the lifeblood of the society, and they used that control to extract labor and loyalty from everyone else. This shadow of complexity was not a Floridian fluke. It appeared globally wherever ecology allowed for the monopolization of nature's bounty. On the other side of the continent, along the Pacific Northwest coast, the Tlingit, the Kwakawakawak, and the Haida lived in a landscape so rich in salmon and marine resources that they settled in permanent, sedentary villages. In California, the Chumash developed a complex maritime society centered on the ownership of large seafaring canoes. Across the ocean, the Ainu of Japan built a highly stratified culture based on the predictable returns of salmon runs and deer hunting. In all these cases, the shift toward hierarchy was driven by a specific ecological condition, clumped resources. Anthropologists have found that inequality tends to emerge whenever key resources are dense, predictable, and concentrated in space. If a resource is spread out and unpredictable, like the berries and game of the Kalahari, it is too expensive to defend, and sharing remains the best strategy. But if the resource is a concentrated salmon stream or a deep-water estuary, it becomes economically defensible. A small group can take control of that spot and demand a tax in labor or loyalty from anyone else who wants to use it. This is the patron-client system in its rawest form, and it represents the moment the fierce egalitarianism described in earlier chapters begins to break down. In these societies, the social capital that was so evenly distributed among the Benjalae became concentrated in the hands of the elite. This concentration was often signaled through the development of standardized valuables or currencies. The Chumash used beads made from olivella shells, while the peoples of the Pacific Northwest used dentalium shells and massive etched copper shields. These were not just ornaments, they were a way to store wealth and rank in a portable, durable form, allowing the nobility to distance themselves from the commoners who performed the daily labor of foraging. The presence of slavery in these societies is perhaps the most jarring challenge to the myth of the noble savage. In the Pacific Northwest, slaves were not just unfortunate captives, they were a vital part of the economic machine. They provided the grueling manual labor required to process the massive salmon runs, allowing the nobility the leisure time to pursue art, ritual, and politics. In some groups, it is estimated that up to a quarter of the population were slaves. This was institutionalized inequality in its most brutal form, existing thousands of miles away from any agricultural field. The shift from egalitarianism to hierarchy also fundamentally altered the relationships between men and women. In the mobile bands we explored previously, we saw a world of gender fluidity where women were often autonomous hunters and decision-makers. But when resources become defensible and owned by specific lineages, they tend to be monopolized by powerful male coalitions. Because these resources require defense and physical control, men often form brother hubs, related groups of males who stay together to protect their property. In this stratified world, marriage ceased to be a personal choice and became a political tool for the nobility. High-ranking families used marriage to form alliances, consolidate resource rights, and move wealth between houses. While women in these societies could still hold significant influence, especially in the matrilineal groups of the North Pacific where names and titles passed through the female line, their lives were increasingly governed by the needs of the lineage and the rigid requirements of rank. The autonomy that allowed a forager woman to simply walk away from an unhappy partnership was replaced by the weight of inherited status and political obligation. This brings us to a powerful metaphor for the loss of freedom, the caging effect. In a mobile band, the ultimate safeguard of equality is the ability to vote with your feet. If someone tries to act like a boss, you can simply leave. But once a community is anchored to a permanent high-value resource like a Calusa water court or a Tlingit salmon weir, that freedom disappears. You cannot walk away from a piece of infrastructure that represents years of labor and your only reliable source of food. You are caged by your own success. When you cannot leave, you must submit to the authority of those who control the cage. The Calusa king's total control over the bodies and time of his subjects was perhaps most hauntingly illustrated by the choir of 500 adolescent girls described by Fontaneda. These girls were required to sing in a synchronized, perfectly timed display of obedience to honor the king and his guests. They sang for as long as the sovereign commanded, their voices a coordinated resource used to signal his prestige. This was a total departure from the individual autonomy of the mobile band. These girls were no longer independent members of a community, but symbols of a sovereign's ability to mobilize and direct human life. The Pacific Northwest nobility displayed their power through a different kind of theater, the potlatch. This was an elaborate ceremony of feasting and gift-giving where a high-ranking individual might give away or even destroy vast amounts of property, blankets, food, and copper shields to validate their status and shame their rivals. This was competitive generosity, a far cry from the demand-sharing of the Kalahari. Here, giving was a weapon used to create debt and cement social standing. If you could not return the gift with interest, you lost face and fell in rank. These societies serve as a warning that the human potential for dominance is always simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right ecological conditions to break through. In these places, the active leveling mechanisms of the Hadza or the Juhansi were overwhelmed by the sheer power of abundance. When there is enough surplus to support a class of people who do not have to forage for their own food, those people will almost inevitably spend their time figuring out how to stay in charge. The mockery and ridicule that cool the hearts of young hunters in the Kalahari are no match for a king who can feed an army and claim the gods as his kin. The Calusa and the Northwest Coast societies show us that the natural state of humanity is not a single point on a map, but a wide spectrum of possibilities. We are a species capable of the most profound equality and the most crushing dominance, often depending on nothing more than the way the salmon run or the tide comes in. The shadow of complexity reminds us that inequality is not a mistake of history, but a recurring pattern that emerges whenever the social tools of leveling are outpaced by the accumulation of wealth. If these hierarchies could emerge among foragers in Florida, California, and the Pacific Northwest, it raises a provocative question about the deep past of our entire species. Were the egalitarian bands of the 20th century really the living fossils of our ancestors, or were they just one possible path? If we look back tens of thousands of years into the darkness of prehistory, will we find only the humble campsites of equals, or will we find the buried crowns of forager kings? To answer that, we have to look at the only evidence that remains, the silent, ornate graves of those who were buried with enough wealth to suggest they were never anyone's equal. Chapter 4. The Buried Crowns of the Ice Age. When we look back at the vast expanse of human history, we are essentially looking into a dark room with a very small flashlight. For a long time, the beam of that flashlight only hit the most recent 5,000 years, where the written word and the ruins of great cities made the story easy to read. But as we push that light further back, into the deep time of the Paleolithic, the story becomes silent. We have no texts and no monuments that still stand. All we have are the bones and the things we chose to put in the ground with them. These burials are the ultimate social statement. They are a snapshot of a moment when a community paused to decide how a person should be remembered. And in those choices, we find the first clear evidence that the ancient world was not always the flat, equal landscape we once imagined. If you want to see the exact moment the myth of the universal egalitarian hunter-gatherer begins to fracture, you have to travel to a site called Sunghir, located in what is now northern Russia. About 34,000 years ago, during the height of the last ice age, a community living on the edge of the permafrost buried their dead in a way that continues to baffle those who believe our ancestors lived only in simple, leaderless bands. In one grave, they found a middle-aged man adorned with nearly 3,000 laboriously carved ivory beads, bracelets of polished mammoth ivory, and a diadem made of fox teeth. This wasn't just a burial, it was an extraordinary investment of human effort. Estimates suggest it would have taken roughly 10,000 work hours just to produce the beads for this one man. In a world where every hour spent carving is an hour not spent hunting or gathering, this represents a staggering concentration of social energy. This wasn't a fluke of the Russian steppe. Across the ancient world, we find burials that suggest a complex intellectual commonwealth led by individuals who held a status that was more than just political. At sites like Dolny Vostonics in Moravia, we find the famous triple burial, where 3 young individuals were placed in striking, intentional postures. One was buried face down, another with a hand placed on the pelvis of a companion, and all were saturated with red ochre and adorned with ornaments. These aren't just disposals of the dead, they are stagings. They suggest a ritual or shamanistic event where the dead were used to tell a story or appease the spirits. These individuals likely held a spiritual status that set them apart, acting as the keepers of the tribe's hidden knowledge. We see the depth of this intellectual world in the very tools they left behind. Simple line ornamentations on bone and stone tools from this era are often interpreted as representing lifelines or the skeletons and spines of animals.
This backbone symbolism connected the hunter to the inua, or the soul of the prey. The people who understood these connections, the ones who could navigate the lifelines of the animals and the movements of the stars, held a form of social capital that was just as powerful as mammoth ivory. Their status was built on hoarding knowledge, a form of prestige that likely existed alongside the merit-based status found in graves like the female hunter of Willamyapaksa.
The desire to maintain a rigid social identity through material culture is perhaps most vividly seen in the Sakak culture of Greenland. For 2,000 years, the Sakak maintained what can only be described as an industrial template for their society. Despite living in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, they used paper-thin driftwood models to ensure that every harpoon, every scraper, and every needle was made with absolute precision, identical to the ones made centuries before. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about maintaining a trademark identity. They would transport kiliak, a specific type of gray slate, over hundreds of kilometers to ensure their tools looked exactly right, even when perfectly functional stone was available right under their feet. In the Sakak world, material culture was a way to freeze a social order in time, ensuring that the group remained a cohesive, recognizable unit across dozens of generations. However, the most profound lesson from these ancient burials is not that hierarchy was inevitable, but that it was often a choice. Recent archaeological theory suggests that many Paleolithic societies were not permanently hierarchical or permanently egalitarian. Instead, they seem to have oscillated between the two. They wore their social structures like a seasonal garment. During certain times of the year, perhaps when resources like mammoth herds or salmon runs were concentrated and abundant, they would gather in large numbers and adopt a rigid hierarchical structure to manage the labor and the ritual. They would crown kings, perform elaborate sacrifices, and build the kind of monuments that leave a mark on the earth.
But when the season changed and the resources thinned out, these same groups would deliberately dismantle their hierarchies. They would break back down into small egalitarian bands, scattering across the landscape where the fierce egalitarianism of the mobile forager was the only way to survive. This facultative egalitarianism suggests that our ancestors were far more politically self-aware than we give them credit for. They didn't just stumble into hierarchy, they experimented with it, used it when it was functional, and discarded it when it threatened their autonomy. They were people who could imagine multiple ways of living and had the social tools to switch between them. This variability is the true mirror of the ancient burial record. It shows us that the struggles we face today, the tension between individual autonomy and group authority, are as old as the human spirit itself. The graves at Sunghir and Dolny Vestonice suggest that the Neolithic Revolution wasn't a sudden fall from grace or a new invention of inequality. Instead, it was the moment when one particular way of living, the sedentary hierarchical way, gained a permanent advantage. The seasonal garment of hierarchy became a permanent uniform. What was it about the shift to permanent settlement that made the egalitarian ethos so difficult to reactivate? Why did the social tools that allowed humans to oscillate between freedom and rank for 30,000 years suddenly lose their edge? To find the answer, we must look at the moment the first surpluses of the farm met the ancient heart of the forager, and ask what was truly lost when we decided to stop moving and start owning.
Chapter 5. The Price of Plenty. How Settlement Shattered Equality. When we look at the long arc of human history, we are often tempted to see the transition from hunting and gathering to farming as a simple upgrade, like moving from a flickering candle to a light bulb. We imagine our ancestors dropping their spears and picking up plows because it was obviously a better, more secure way to live. But the more we study the crossroads where these two worlds meet, the more we realize that this shift wasn't just about how we got our calories. It was a fundamental rewiring of the human social soul.
The egalitarianism that defined our species for hundreds of thousands of years didn't just fade away. It was dismantled by a new set of economic and social realities that the old leveling mechanisms simply couldn't handle. We are currently standing at an evolutionary crossroads where the ancient heart of the forager is being forced to navigate a world of surplus, permanent settlement, and global markets. And the results are revealing the true fragility of human equality.
To understand why the egalitarian ethos begins to crumble, we first have to understand the difference between what anthropologists call immediate return and delayed return economies. For most of our history, humans lived in immediate return societies, like the Hadza of Tanzania or the Juwansi of the Kalahari. In these groups, you go out, you find food, and you eat it almost immediately. There is no storage, no accumulation, and therefore no way for one person to become a provider for the rest of the group. If you can't keep a surplus, you can't use it to buy influence or create debts. But the moment a society moves toward a delayed return system, where you invest labor today for a harvest months in the future, the social contract changes. Whether it's the salmon-rich rivers of the Pacific Northwest or the first wheat fields of the Fertile Crescent, the ability to store food is the ability to store power. Surplus creates a new kind of individual relationship, the patron and the client. In a mobile band, if someone tries to act like a boss, you can simply leave. But once a community becomes sedentary, anchored to a specific piece of land or a permanent fishing weir, that freedom of movement, the ultimate safeguard of equality, disappears. You can't just walk away from a year's worth of stored grain or a house that took months to build. This caging effect means that people are forced to stay and endure the rise of big men who manage the surplus. We see this destabilization even today among the Hadza. Recent research from Baylor University shows that as Hadza individuals begin to interface more with Tanzania's cash-based markets and agricultural neighbors, their legendary egalitarianism starts to fray. They are becoming more tolerant of unequal outcomes, especially when it comes to non-foraged goods like grain or money. The old rules of demand sharing, where anyone can ask for a portion of what you have, don't seem to apply as strictly to a bag of store-bought maize as they do to a hunted zebra. This shift in how we handle resources has a devastating impact on the relationship between men and women. In the mobile, immediate return bands of the Akta and the Mbengele, we saw a world of remarkable gender parity. Because these groups are highly mobile and membership is fluid, men and women have equal autonomy. A key factor in this equality is the lack of brother hubs. In many sedentary agricultural societies, the social structure is built on patrilocality, the practice of men staying in their natal villages while women move to live with their husband's family. This creates powerful, related male coalitions that can easily monopolize resources and control the lives of women. But among egalitarian foragers, couples move freely between the camps of both sets of parents. This multi-level sociality ensures that no one sex can form a dominant power block. However, as groups settle down and start to claim ownership over specific resource patches, they almost always shift toward patrilocality. When land or a specific fishing spot becomes property that must be defended and inherited, it pays for men to form alliances with their male kin. This transition marks the birth of the patriarchy as we know it. The cooperative couple of the Akta, who share work and leisure 50-50, is replaced by a household where the man controls the property and the woman's labor is increasingly directed toward his lineage. We can see this process happening in real time among the Tsimane people of the Bolivian Amazon. Traditionally, the Tsimane have been a relatively egalitarian society where status was built on merit, humility, and community-mindedness. But as they become more integrated into the market economy, the definition of merit is changing. Wealth is starting to trump wisdom. Individuals who are successful in the market can accumulate material goods that set them apart from their neighbors, creating a social distance that mockery and ridicule can no longer bridge. The fierce egalitarianism that once relied on face-to-face social pressure is being outpaced by the impersonal nature of market transactions. You can mock a neighbor for being proud of a scrawny antelope, but it's much harder to mock someone for having a larger bank account or a more modern house when those things provide a tangible advantage in a changing world. One of the most counterintuitive findings in this study is that unequal societies didn't spread because they were better or more stable. In fact, a major demographic simulation conducted at Stanford University found that in a stable environment, societies with unequal access to resources are actually more likely to go extinct. They are inherently destabilizing because they create a desperate underclass and a fragile elite. So why did they take over the world? The simulation revealed a dark secret. The very instability of unequal societies is what makes them so invasive. Because they are prone to internal conflict and resource depletion, they have a massive incentive to migrate and expand.
Egalitarian societies, by contrast, tend to have stable populations and stay within their ecological limits. They don't feel the need to conquer their neighbors. But an unequal, stratified society is like a social wildfire. It must constantly find new fuel to survive. These hierarchical groups spread across the globe not because they provided a higher quality of life, but because they were better at organized conflict and territorial expansion. They outcompeted, displaced, or absorbed the more stable egalitarian bands, exactly as we've seen in the historical record of the last 10,000 years. This expansion changed the very nature of human conflict. In the world of the mobile forager, conflict was often personal and short-lived. If things got too heated, the group would split up, a process of voting with your feet that prevented small grudges from turning into blood feuds. But in a sedentary, stratified society, conflict becomes institutionalized. Warfare in these groups isn't just about personal honor. It's about the conquest of land and the capture of slaves. As we saw with the Calusa of Florida and the peoples of the Pacific Northwest, these complex foraging societies used their surplus to support a professional warrior class. This is a far cry from the bloodless skirmishes of the Wintu or the Co-Bushmen. When you have a king and a nobility to protect, violence becomes a tool of the state.
The integration of modern foragers into the global market is the final act in this long dismantling of equality. For groups like the San or the Hadza, the pressure to conform to the outside world is inescapable. They are being pushed onto smaller and smaller tracts of land, often the most marginal and difficult environments, while their traditional territories are taken over by ranchers, farmers, and tourists. This land encroachment makes the old mobile lifestyle impossible. When you can no longer move to follow the game, you are forced to settle. And once you settle, you are forced to enter the market to buy the things you can no longer forage. This market integration introduces a new kind of social stress. In the old world of demand sharing, everyone was headman over himself. But in the market world, you have to answer to employers, government bureaucrats, and park rangers. The individual autonomy that was the pride of the hunter-gatherer is replaced by a new kind of dependency. We see this in the changing child-rearing practices of groups in transition. The non-directive, playful education of the forager child, where they are free to explore and learn at their own pace, is being replaced by formal schooling, designed to turn them into productive workers for the state. The values of cooperation and sharing are being eroded by a curriculum that emphasizes competition and individual achievement.
Even the spiritual life of these communities is being destabilized. The animistic worldview, which taught that every plant and animal had a soul and deserved respect, is being replaced by religions that often emphasize human dominance over nature and a more hierarchical view of the divine. The shaman, who once mediated between equals in the spirit world, is replaced by priests or ministers who represent a more structured and often patriarchal authority. This loss of spiritual egalitarianism removes one of the most powerful ideological supports for the old way of life. If the gods are no longer equal and capricious, why should the people be? But perhaps the most profound change is what happens to the human play theory of social existence. As we've seen, hunter-gatherers used play and humor as a deliberate tool to keep society level. They turned their work into play, their religion into play, and their governance into a social game where no one was allowed to win too much. But the market and the farm are not playful places. They are places of serious, disciplined labor and rigid schedules. The playful religious practices of the Mbuti or the Juansi are hard to maintain when you have to be in a field or a factory at a certain time every day. When life becomes about accumulation rather than experience, the room for play shrinks.
The crossroads we are currently navigating is a place of profound loss, but also of profound revelation. It shows us that the egalitarianism of our ancestors was not a primitive default, but a sophisticated social choice. It was a system that recognized the human urge for dominance and built a culture specifically designed to thwart it. It was a world where the merit of an individual was measured by their generosity and their humility rather than their bank account. As we see these last egalitarian bands struggling to maintain their identity in the face of market integration, we are forced to confront the reality that our own highly unequal society is not the inevitable result of human nature, but the result of the specific economic and social choices we have made over the last 10 millennia. As the Hadza hunter-gatherer stands at the edge of a new Tanzanian highway, watching the trucks carry grain and consumer goods past his ancestral lands, he is a living symbol of this evolutionary crossroads. He represents a way of being that sustained our species for almost the entirety of our existence. A way of being that prioritized the person over the property and the group over the individual. His struggle to maintain the I in egalitarianism in a world that demands hierarchy is our struggle too. It raises a question that we are only just beginning to ask ourselves in the modern world. If equality was a deliberate cultural achievement that we once knew how to maintain, is it something we could ever learn to build again? Or was the transition to surplus and sedentism a one-way door that has closed behind us forever?
So, were hunter-gatherer societies truly egalitarian? The answer is both yes and no. For mobile bands in lean environments, equality was a hard-won cultural achievement, enforced through tools like ridicule and demand sharing to prevent dominance. Yet, as we saw, where resources were abundant and defensible, hierarchy could and did emerge, revealing a human capacity for both fierce equality and stark stratification. This tells us that inequality is not an inevitable human destiny, but a possibility that flourishes under specific conditions, particularly the ability to accumulate and control surplus. Our ancestors' history shows a spectrum of social choices, challenging us to consider which parts of that ancient egalitarian spirit might still be relevant today. Thank you for listening.